What's going on, everyone? Hope you're having a great day. Before we get into this, if you appreciate clear, level-headed crypto discussions without hype or fear, take a second right now to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you think, and it allows conversations like this to keep reaching people who actually want context instead of noise. Now let's talk about why Ripple and XRP are suddenly back in the spotlight, and why you're seeing headlines suggesting that something major may be shifting behind the scenes, involving institutional attention, including names that carry serious weight in traditional finance. When people hear a phrase like BlackRock pulled the trigger, it's easy to imagine a single dramatic action that instantly changes the market. In reality, institutions don't move that way. They don't make emotional decisions, they don't chase candles, and they don't act on rumors. What they do instead is far less dramatic and far more important. They research, they structure, they test exposure, and they position themselves long before anything becomes obvious to the public. So when narratives like this start circulating, the right question isn't, did something explode overnight? The right question is, what kind of institutional behavior would logically happen at this stage of the market? And what signals would we realistically expect to see? BlackRock and firms like it operate under strict regulatory, fiduciary, and risk management frameworks. They don't announce interest casually, and they don't engage in assets without understanding long-term implications. When their name appears in conversations around digital assets, it's usually because of infrastructure, market maturity, or demand from clients, not hype. Ripple and XRP sit in a very specific category of crypto. Unlike many projects that exist purely within speculative markets, XRP has always been positioned around payments, liquidity, and cross-border settlement. That doesn't guarantee success, but it does mean its relevance isn't based on trends alone. One of the biggest misunderstandings in crypto media is how institutional involvement actually works. Institutions don't buy the top or announce the bottom. They engage through products, exposure vehicles, custody solutions, liquidity analysis, and regulatory clarity. Most of that happens quietly. So when people say, this changes everything, what they often mean is that the conversation itself has shifted. XRP is no longer being discussed only as a retail-driven asset, but as part of a broader financial infrastructure discussion. That shift matters more than any short-term price reaction. Another thing to understand is that large asset managers don't need to believe in a narrative to participate. They only need demand, structure, and risk-adjusted opportunity. Whether someone personally likes XRP is irrelevant at that scale. What matters is whether it can fit into a portfolio strategy, a market product, or a client demand framework. In the US especially, regulatory positioning plays a massive role. Institutions wait, they watch, they let uncertainty resolve, and once it does, they move carefully, not loudly. That's why institutional adoption often looks boring at first. People also underestimate how long financial product development takes. Any exposure vehicle involving digital assets goes through layers of legal review, compliance checks, and risk modeling. By the time something is visible to the public, the decision-making process has usually been underway for a long time. That's why sudden headlines feel shocking. They compress months or years of groundwork into a single sentence. For XRP specifically, its history with regulation has forced it to mature in a way many projects haven't. That process hasn't been easy, but it has created a level of scrutiny that institutions actually understand. Familiar risk is often easier to price than unknown risk. It's also important to be clear about what this does not mean. It does not mean guaranteed price increases. It does not mean overnight adoption. It does not mean anyone should rush into decisions. Markets don't work that way, and responsible analysis never claims they do. What it does mean is that the asset class itself is being evaluated differently than it was a few years ago. Digital assets are no longer automatically dismissed as experimental. They're being categorized, filtered, and selectively integrated. XRP's utility-focused design makes it easier to place into those conversations. Speed, liquidity efficiency, and cost reduction are concepts institutions already care about. Crypto just offers new tools to address them. Another factor that often gets ignored is timing. Markets don't move when information appears. They move when positioning changes, and positioning changes gradually, not all at once. That's why price action often feels disconnected from headlines. The real decisions happen long before the reaction becomes visible. This is also where retail psychology comes into play. Retail participants often feel late because they only notice changes when media coverage increases. Institutions notice long before that because they're watching structure, not sentiment. That doesn't mean retail participants can't benefit. It just means the approach needs to be different. Less prediction, more understanding, less urgency, more patience. The phrase must watch should never mean must act. It should mean must understand. Understanding the difference between speculation and infrastructure is critical. Speculation moves fast and fades fast. Infrastructure moves slowly and lasts. XRP exists much closer to the infrastructure side of that spectrum than most people realize. Whether that ultimately translates into broader adoption is still an open question, but the conversation itself is no longer theoretical. Another important point is that institutions don't need everything to be perfect. To participate, they need clarity, not certainty. Markets are built on managing risk, not eliminating it. As clarity improves, participation becomes possible. That's the real shift people are sensing right now. Not a single event, but a change in conditions. It's also worth remembering that financial markets are adaptive. As new tools emerge, old assumptions get challenged. Digital assets are part of that evolution, not an overnight replacement. XRP's role, if it continues to exist, will be shaped by how well it integrates rather than disrupts. Integration is slower, but it's also more sustainable. For viewers watching this, the most important takeaway is not excitement, but awareness. Awareness of how institutions think. Awareness of how narratives form. Awareness of how markets really move. No one owes the market a reaction. No asset owes anyone performance. Everything unfolds on its own timeline. If something meaningful develops, it will show up through structure, not slogans. And that's why moments like this feel important, not because everything has already changed, but because the conversation around what's possible is clearly evolving. Stay calm, stay informed, and always separate headlines from reality. That's how you survive in markets that reward patience far more often than speed. And that's the real story behind why XRP is being watched so closely right now. And when you continue to look at this situation through that lens, another layer starts to become clear. Markets don't move because of belief alone, and they don't move because of disbelief either. They move because capital finds pathways that make sense under existing rules. When rules change, or even when clarity around those rules improves, pathways open up that didn't exist before. This is where a lot of people misunderstand institutional behavior. Institutions don't need headlines to act. In fact, headlines often appear because institutions have already acted in subtle ways. Filings, infrastructure partnerships, custody solutions, and product frameworks tend to come first. Public awareness comes later. So when XRP appears in conversations that include large asset managers, it doesn't automatically mean a single massive decision was made overnight. It means the asset is being evaluated within a broader framework that didn't previously include it in the same way. Another key point here is that institutional involvement doesn't look like what retail investors imagine. It's not a sudden market buy. It's exposure strategies, hedging, baskets, derivatives, and client-driven demand. Price is only one variable in that equation. This is also why short-term reactions often disappoint people. They expect fireworks, but institutions don't create fireworks. They create stability, and stability isn't exciting to watch in real time.